New York Times, Dateline, Washington, May 11, 1916. Envoys from the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage reach Washington May 16 to deliver the voting women's ultimatum to Congress. Pass the Susan B. Anthony Votes for Women Amendment in this session or prepare for war.
Across America, women are working, like men, and trying to convince Congress to give them the right to vote, like men.
At that time, their powerlessness was quite total. I mean, they didn't have the vote. They weren't in any way integrated into the political system. And without a vote, they had no way to complain other than in their homes. And they began to want a more public way to complain and to express their own ideas.
New York Times reporter Catherine Manigault provides the reporter's perspective as we report on the campaign for women's right to vote, live from the past. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson is in the White House. Henry Ford's Model T rules the streets. The movies have not yet begun to talk. And women are on the job. Almost 8 million of them, almost twice as many as 25 years before. But despite their increased presence in the workplace, in the political arena, women still hold only second-class citizenship. In 1916, only 11 states permit women to vote in all elections. Woman suffrage, women's right to vote, has been debated in the United States since before the Civil War, when movement matriarchs like Susan B. Anthony placed on the national agenda. But progress has been slow. There has been widespread opposition. Brewers and distillers have opposed the suffrage movement since its beginnings as an offshoot of the temperance movement. Many in the South fear that votes for women will lead to votes for blacks. And some manufacturers worry that women with votes would press for improved conditions for women and men workers. And even some women oppose woman suffrage. Voting, they say, is part of politics, and involvement with politics could tarnish women's moral authority. The suffrage movement is also slowed by problems from within its ranks. The movement is scattered around the country, with state headquarters operating from movement leaders' homes. The movement's political tactics have often been more polite than forceful. In 1908, for example, an effort to win President Theodore Roosevelt's endorsement of women's suffrage is begun with a polite letter asking Roosevelt if a petition would carry any weight with him. No, he replies, just as politely, it would not. The idea is abandoned. And the suffrage movement has been slowed by its strategy of splitting movement resources to fight costly state-by-state campaigns for statewide voting rights. But by 1916, the suffrage movement has new leaders and a new strategy. At 57, Carrie Chapman Catt heads the nation's largest suffrage group, the National Woman Suffrage Organization, the National. A former teacher and journalist, she gives the suffrage movement the centralized leadership the movement has lacked. From another leader, Alice Paul, the suffrage movement gets a badly needed infusion of fire and focus. A New Jersey-born Quaker and social worker, Paul is a veteran of the militant British suffrage movement, where, like other British suffragists, she was jailed for demonstrating and force-fed to break her hunger strike. Paul advocates a national campaign for a national right-to-vote amendment to the Constitution, a Susan B. Anthony amendment, she calls it, that would use the power women have achieved in the states where they can already vote to advance the cause nationwide. Hall is named chairman of the National's Congressional Committee, but her confrontational strategy comes to conflict with Carrie Katz's more ladylike lobbying approach. One of them has to go. Hall leaves the National and founds a new organization, the National Woman's Party. Hall's departure seems to signal greater fragmentation in the women's fragile solidarity, but the competition becomes a powerful symbiosis. Hall's grand gestures and militant tactics keep women's suffrage in the headlines, while Katz, state by state, congressman by congressman lobbying, turns attention into support and support into votes. By 1918, women's growing political power is strong enough to pass a Susan B. Anthony amendment in the House of Representatives, but not in the Senate. The defeat triggers an all-out effort by the suffrage forces. And in 1919, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment is back on the floor of Congress. In the House, where the joint resolution containing the amendment passed by a whisker in 1918, it passes easily in 1919. Now, it is up to the Senate. One by one, the old barons who ruled the Senate rise to oppose the amendment. Some say that women will be uninformed and unpredictable voters. Others that women will vote at their husband's command. And still others say that qualifications for voting are up to state voters and legislatures, not the federal government. But more senators support the amendment than oppose it. Women will vote their own consciences, they say, not their husbands'. And the right to vote is so important, they say, that it needs to be guaranteed to all women in all states. The Senate debates for days before the final vote.
Dateline, Washington, June 4th, 1919. After a long and persistent fight, advocates of women's suffrage won a victory in the Senate today when that body, by a vote of 56 to 25, adopted the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to the Constitution.
Suffragists celebrate the passage of the Anthony Amendment, but they still face another hurdle, ratification. In fact, they face 36 hurdles, the 36 states needed to ratify a constitutional amendment. Some hurdles are lower than others. 3 states ratify the amendment in the first week after it passes Congress, 8 more in the first month, and 8 more in the first 5 months. The Maryland legislature rejects the amendment. Voter qualifications, they say, are for them, not the federal government, to decide. Alice Paul swings into action when the Republican governors of Connecticut and Vermont refuse to call their legislatures into special session to consider the amendment. 5,000 suffragists answer Paul's call to demonstrate at the Republican convention in Chicago. But the governors are unmoved. By August of 1920, 35 states have approved. Only 1 more is needed. But opponents need to win only 13 states to block the amendment. 8 southern states have joined Maryland and Delaware in rejecting the amendment, and Connecticut and Vermont have still not considered it. That leaves Tennessee as the last hope for the suffragists and the anti-suffragists. Both sides target the special session of the Tennessee legislature set for August 9th. Tennessee suffragists summon Carrie Katt. She arrives in Nashville July 20th with an overnight bag and stays for 5 weeks, commanding the pro-suffrage forces with the care and finesse for which she and the National are famous. On the 8th floor of Nashville's Hermitage Hotel, amendment opponents set up shop, entertaining and cajoling wavering Tennessee lawmakers. Ratification carries easily in the state Senate, but the Tennessee House of Representatives is evenly split. The August 18th vote hinges on the representative of an anti-suffrage East Tennessee district, the legislature's youngest member, 24-year-old Harry Byrne. Byrne is lobbied by the suffragists, the anti-suffragists, and his mother. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat, she writes her son. Vote for suffrage. Harry Byrne votes yes. Tennessee Governor Roberts' certification is dispatched by train to Washington, D.C., where it is presented to Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby.
Dateline Washington, August 26, 1920. The half-century struggle for women's suffrage reached its climax at 8 o'clock this morning when Bainbridge Colby, as Secretary of State, issued his proclamation announcing that the 19th Amendment had become a part of the Constitution of the United States.
New York Times reporter Catherine Manigault has covered women's issues.
That period was different in every detail, and actually some historians trace the beginning of the movement toward the vote, and they connect it a bit with prohibition, and they connect it with violence against women, because in a period before the 20s when there were just starting to be tremendous alcohol abuse, and particularly in some impoverished places, and it led to the beating of a lot of women. And it began to politicize them in a different way, and so some women started to say, because they had no rights, they had very few legal rights, they could not vote, and it caused them to focus in a different way on that problem and on their powerlessness.
Why did so many men and some women oppose suffrage so strongly for so long?
Oh, I think a whole lot of reasons, but ultimately it's completely an issue of power. And if you suddenly have 50% of the population that was not voting before, I mean, we had the same thing over the issue of whether blacks could vote and former slaves. Once you give someone the vote, you give them power. And there's always a lot of fear among people with power of losing power. But I think people feared a kind of chaos and a kind of cultural chaos.
How was the suffrage movement ultimately able to overcome that kind of deeply rooted opposition?
There's a wonderful piece in the New York Times in 1920 about the movement to give women the vote, and there's something totally unself-consciously stated there, which is, well, and using their feminine wiles, they have, you know, they're closer to getting this right to vote. It's somehow easier to sort of say, oh, well, these are the feminine wiles, than to say, this has been really good politics, this has been basic competence, this is a sign of tremendous intelligence and sort of really good strategy and an ability to move within the system.
2 months later, millions of women vote for the first time and help to elect a pro-suffrage president, Warren G. Harding. Getting the vote is just the first of the political and cultural freedoms that flow to women in the 20s. Greater freedom for women breeds greater prominence.
The experience which is the most valuable is the experience of doing things for yourself.
And more women in public office. 3/4 of a century after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the number of women running for public office finally begins to take off. With all the gains that women have made since getting the vote, can we safely assume that the right to vote has resolved all of women's problems?
I'm sure you asked me that question to make me laugh. No, I don't think you can assume that. The questions that are still unresolved, they're more pointed to questions of power. And this is why women in politics is still a rough issue, because it's women and power, taken directly. And it's sort of the final frontier, because it's women and power totally fused. It's not just women saying, okay, and I'm going to turn this lever, and then somebody else in power will actually make the decisions. It's a decision to pass a bill. I mean, it's a very kind of direct tie to power. And I think those issues are still really rough. Ultimately, in a broader social sense, those kind of basic issues of access to jobs, access to education, are defined through the legislature. And so to vote is to influence the legislature. And that's why it's such a sacred right in this country.